Swallows are one of my favorite things about spring in the garden. Here in Maine, we're most familiar with barn and tree swallows. These birds are worth whatever effort it takes to get them to find your garden attractive. They'll serve as both entertainment and natural pest control as they dive and swerve overhead, catching mosquitoes and other annoying bugs. Fortunately, it isn't actually hard to attract barn and tree swallows to a garden like mine. It's basically their preferred habitat. Open meadows and farm fields sheltered by nearby forest with lots of water. Many years ago, I learned from my father-in-law how to make the swallow's preferred type of nesting box, and I made several. I've got 2 new houses nearly complete. All I need to do is drill the holes that serve as the doorway for the birds. In the meantime, I need to do a little fixing up on these older boxes, particularly the cedar posts atop which they're mounted. Cedar is a naturally rot-resistant wood. Each region in the world has a species with this characteristic. In Maine, we got eastern white cedar. This wood is wonderful to work with, and this rot resistance makes it ideal for a lot of uses on the farm, such as fence posts and scaffolding for the occasional tree swallow penthouse suite. But rot resistant is not the same as rot proof. Even cedar will succumb to the processes of natural decomposition if it's in contact with a damp earth long enough. However, the nice thing about a fence post, or a birdhouse post in this case, at least on our homestead, is that I cut them longer than I need for the first use. The idea being, when the bottom begins to rot, I can pull it out of the ground, cut off the bad part, resharpen, and get a few more years out of it. This suits my natural tendencies, bred into me by my ancestors, the most important of whom in my living memory was my great-grandmother, who was 28 when the Great Depression hit, and from whom I imbibed the true meaning and value of the old saying, use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. In the case of swallows in the garden, do without is not an option for me. Having them around is not only useful for their pest control, but also for my mental health. I really value their presence. They return to the garden every year around Earth Day. Last spring, I saw the first one on April 23rd. Mouse in there. That's not from a sparrow or a swallow. Partially in homage to Great Grammy Dow, I'm going to use up, wear out, and make do with these old posts by getting a few more years out of them, albeit a dite shorter than they've been up to this point. However, since I first made these posts and raised them as swallow houses to the sky, I've learned a trick or two. Not least useful amongst them is a trick I learned from Will Bonsall for prolonging the life of a cedar post. We'll get to that in a minute. Along with the method of cedar post preservation Will Bonsall shares in one of his books, I've also learned a few things just from my own observations, experience, and general distaste for waste. One such trick involves the use of as much of a cedar post as possible, including the sawdust and the pieces you cut off when sharpening a fence post. In this case, my fence is actually a trellis upon which my peas can climb. Pea vines and pods, particularly at the height of their fruiting, weigh a lot. If your posts aren't in the ground very far, or really rugged, they can easily be bent over and even snapped off at the base. I've experienced this firsthand and it's very frustrating because, of course, it happens just as the peas are ready to harvest. But if you collect the little wedges of cedar that come off a round post as you sharpen the bottom to a point, you can use them to brace the base of your post in the ground. You'll have a greater selection of these wedges when you sharpen freshly cut cedar. Since I'm resharpening old cedar, some of the cutoffs are too far gone for even this task, which requires a solid, wide-topped wedge piece. However, I'm not going to waste these either. The punky pieces that cannot be used for anything else, once dry, make excellent kindling for the wood stove. And the sawdust I'm raking and saving in an old dog food bag makes excellent nesting box material for the hens. Now, back to that tip I picked up from Will Bonzel. I resharpened the old Swallow House posts where I did, right next to the fire pit, because the next day was Martin's 9th birthday, and we were planning to have a bonfire. To preserve the sharpened tips of my cedar posts, I'm going to burn them. Not too much, just enough to create a blackened, charred seal, in which any moisture and remaining sap, this works really well with fresh cedar, is essentially melted and fused into the wood. This is sort of like, to my mind, the way wood was for generations preserved by pressure treating it with creosote, which we now know is terrible for us and the earth. I'm using fire to create a protective shell around the point of the post, but not to the point of creosote. A word to the wise, which also comes from Will's book. Whatever you burn that is above ground will cover you in black char every time you touch it, so I try to only burn the part that will be in the ground. I also don't bother with this for, as you saw, my pea trellis posts. Anything that is temporary in that it will only be in the ground for a single growing season is likely not worth doing this to, as you'll be pulling it out of the garden in a few short months and likely get the char all over you. But for these swallow posts, I expect them to last a long time and not come out again for another decade or so. For that application, this trick works quite well.